A lone Allied bomber limps through the sky, its wings torn and one of its engines trailing a thin, black ribbon of smoke. 6 Japanese fighters circle above, like patient vultures. The crew expects the kill shot to come at any second. But then the pilot does something that breaks every single rule in the manual, and what happens next will be studied in flight schools for decades to come. The year is 1943, the location is New Guinea. The sky above the Coral Sea is not a romantic or a beautiful place. It smells of high-octane aviation fuel and of hot, burnt rubber. The heat inside the cockpit of a B-25 Mitchell bomber flying at 12,000 feet turns the cramped, metallic space into a suffocating sweatbox. The radio chatter is a constant, crackling stream of static, punctuated by the sharp, clipped phrases of panic and of professionalism. Below, the jungle stretches out in every direction, an endless and indifferent sea of green. It is a landscape that swallows wreckage without ceremony, that erases the evidence of human conflict with a quiet, vegetable patience. This is the operational area of the United States 5th Air Force, flying under the command of General George Kenney. For the men of this Air Force, the war is a long and lonely series of grueling missions, flown over thousands of miles of open water with absolutely no margin for error. If your engines fail, you ditch your aircraft in the ocean. If you ditch in the ocean, you disappear. In the skies over the islands, the Japanese control the airspace in pockets, and their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters are the undisputed masters of that domain. The Zero is faster in a turn, it is more agile, and it is flown by pilots who have been trained, in some cases, since childhood, for the singular art of aerial combat. The American bomber crews, by contrast, are being fed into a brutal and unforgiving grinder. They are losing planes and they are losing men at a rate that keeps the intelligence officers at headquarters awake at night, staring at their charts and their casualty lists. The math of this war is simple, and it is brutal. Every single mission costs machines, and it costs men. The replacements arrive on the transport planes every week, their faces fresh, their training often incomplete. Some of them will last for 3 sorties, some of them will last for only 1. The problem facing the 5th Air Force in 1943 is not just tactical, it is mathematical. The American bombers are being shot down faster than they can be replaced. The Japanese Zero fighters dominate any and all close-range engagements. American doctrine, the official set of rules for how to fight, relies on 2 things: speed and altitude. The plan is simple: fly high, drop your bombs, and fly home as fast as you can, except it is not working. The Zeros can climb faster than the American intelligence had predicted. They coordinate their attacks with a brutal and almost artistic efficiency. They exploit the blind spots in the bomber's defensive armament, the small patches of sky where the gunners cannot see. The American gunners, peering through their thick plexiglass windows, cannot track the fast-moving, nimble fighters, and the fighter escorts, the American P-38s and P-47s that are supposed to protect the bombers, are stretched thin, their numbers too few to cover the thousands of miles of contested ocean. The bomber crews are, for all practical purposes, on their own. The intelligence officers study the after-action reports, and they find a grim and repeating pattern. When a bomber crew encounters a group of enemy fighters, their survival depends on 2 and only 2 things: luck and the sheer volume of their own defensive firepower. Maneuvering, they have discovered, rarely helps. The bombers are too heavy, they are too slow, and they are too unmaneuverable. To try and dogfight a Zero in a B-25 is an act of suicide, so the official doctrine becomes one of rigid and stoic endurance. Maintain your speed, stay in your tight defensive formation, rely on your gunners, and do not, under any circumstances, deviate from the plan. But the men keep dying. The commanders try everything. They add more guns to the bombers. They alter the flight paths. They schedule the missions for different times of the day, hoping to catch the Japanese off guard. but nothing changes the fundamental and fatal equation. A zero can outmaneuver a bomber. Period. Some of the more desperate pilots try their own wild, evasive tactics. They will put their heavy bombers into steep dives. They will bank hard. They will even try to spiral down to the deck. Most of them crash or stall out. A few manage to survive, and they are promptly grounded by their commanding officers for their recklessness. The message from the brass is clear. Do not experiment. Follow the procedure and accept the losses. Into this grinder, into this world of brutal math and accepted losses, steps a man who will, in his own quiet and methodical way, change the entire equation. His name is Jay Zeamer Jr. Jay Zeamer Jr. does not look like a warrior. He is tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses that are constantly fogging up in the oppressive New Guinea humidity. He is a recent graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, with a degree in civil engineering. He speaks in quiet, careful, and precise sentences, as if every single word he utters has been triple-checked for its structural integrity. His crewmates, in the casual, affectionate, and sometimes cruel way of soldiers, have a nickname for him. They call him Jay-Z. Behind his back, some of them call him the Bookworm. Zeamer reads obsessively, while the other men in his squadron are playing cards or writing letters home or trying to lose themselves in the temporary release of a bottle of whiskey. He sits in the corner of the barracks with a stack of thick, dry, technical manuals. He studies the after-action reports from every mission, successful or failed. Now even manages to get his hands on a translated copy of the Japanese flight doctrine. He sketches complex geometric diagrams in the margins of his notebooks, and he asks questions, quiet, thoughtful, and deeply irritating questions that his commanding officers do not want to hear. Questions like, why do we always insist on dogfighting on their terms? What if we simply stop trying to outrun them? He does not fit the mold, the archetype of the American fighter pilot. The image that is projected in the newsreels and the propaganda posters is one of a cocky, instinctive, and almost reckless aggression. Zeamer is none of these things. He calculates, he hesitates, he second-guesses. In the eyes of the military brass, this makes him a dangerous man. Not dangerous to the enemy, but dangerous to himself and to the rigid discipline of the unit. He is reassigned again and again. He flows between the different squadrons of the 5th Air Force like a spare part that no one is quite sure how to install. He flies co-pilot missions. He fills in for pilots who are sick or on leave, and he slowly racks up his combat hours without ever being given the command of his own permanent crew. It is a quiet and subtle form of professional exile. The war is full of men like him, men who are competent enough to keep around, but who are too odd, too intellectual, too unwilling to conform to ever be promoted. Some pilots would wear these repeated reassignments like a scar, a mark of their failure. Zeamer, however, seems to treat each one as a new research opportunity. He studies how the different squadrons operate. He takes meticulous notes on what works and, more importantly, on what gets people killed. He keeps a notebook, a private ledger of the war's brutal mathematics. Then something in his approach begins to shift. Zeamer starts volunteering for the missions that no one else will take. The long solo reconnaissance flights deep into enemy-held airspace, often in outdated and battle-worn planes, with only a skeleton crew. The photo mapping missions, the intelligence gathering runs, these are the jobs where you either come back with the data or you do not come back at all. And in the process of flying these lonely and dangerous missions, he begins to assemble a crew of his own, a crew of fellow misfits, men who have also been cycled out of the mainstream squadrons, men who have been overlooked or written off or busted down in rank. His bombardier is a man with the lingering physical scars of malaria. His navigator is a man who had once crash-landed in the ocean and had to swim 5 miles to a deserted shore. His gunner is a man who had refused a direct and what he considered to be a suicidal order, and had been busted down in rank as a result. These men, these outcasts, they trust Zeamer. They trust him because he does not waste their lives on empty bravado. He strips down a beaten-up B-25, reinforcing the gun positions and adding an extra forward-facing cannon for good measure. He runs his fuel calculations down to the last single gallon. He briefs his crew not with the usual patriotic slogans, but with the cold, hard, and strangely reassuring language of math. "If we burn fuel at this rate," he will say, pointing to a chart, "we will have exactly 17 minutes over the target. If we take fire from this sector, we will divert to this heading. If the port engine quits, we will have enough power to glide for this far." It is not inspiring. It is not heroic. But it is accurate. His crewmates also notice something strange and unsettling about him. Zeamer never, ever panics, even when an engine catches fire over the Bismarck Sea, even when a burst of anti-aircraft flak tears a hole in the fuselage the size of a dinner plate. He will narrate the problem aloud, clinically, dispassionately, like a surgeon calling out for his instruments. "Oil pressure is dropping on number 1. We have an altitude loss of 200 feet per minute. Trim is compensating." It unnerves some of the men. It deeply reassures others. There is no hysteria in his voice. There is only data. By the middle of 1943, Jay Zeamer Jr. has flown more than 40 combat missions. He is still a captain. He is still overlooked by the high command. He is still the Bookworm. But his crew is now loyal to him in a way that transcends rank and official procedure. They know that he will not waste them. He will not showboat. He will calculate their survival, and then he will execute that calculation with a cold and flawless precision. That loyalty is about to be tested in the most extreme way imaginable. While Jay Zeamer Jr. was quietly testing the margins of combat survival, the central bloody equation of the air war in the Pacific remained unchanged. American bombers were being shot down faster than they could be replaced, and the primary executioner was the Mitsubishi A6M0. Zeamer, in his obsessive, almost academic study of the conflict, began to read the after-action reports not as stories of heroism or tragedy, but as raw data sets. He noticed a grim and repeating pattern. The worst of the casualties, the highest percentage of losses, almost always occurred during the chase. After the bombers had completed their run and were heading for home, the Zeros would pursue them, patiently, relentlessly, and pick them apart from the rear. The American bombers, following their doctrine, would try to outrun them. They could not. The Zeros were faster. The Japanese pilots would then settle into the bombers' tail-blind spot, that vulnerable 6 o'clock position, and they would fire again and again until something vital on the American plane exploded. Every single American flight manual, every tactical directive said the same thing in this situation: maximize your throttle, get as much distance as you can, and pray. But Zeamer, the quiet engineer, saw a fundamental flaw in that logic. If you cannot outrun your enemy, and you cannot outturn your enemy, what option is left? He began to think not like a pilot, but like a physicist. He started to think about the concept of energy states. A Zero, flying at a high speed, has an immense amount of kinetic energy, of pure momentum. It takes time for that fighter to slow down. It takes time for the pilot to adjust his speed and his position. If a bomber, the target of that attack, were to suddenly and dramatically decelerate, the fighter, for a brief, critical moment, would be unable to compensate. It would overshoot. It would not be by much, perhaps just 2 or 3 seconds, but in the violent, compressed time frame of aerial combat, 2 seconds is an eternity. He sketched the idea out in his notebook. The geometry was simple, but the implications were profound. If you were to reduce your throttle at the exact moment that a Zero had committed to its final attack run, the fighter would shoot past you. The Japanese pilot, his target suddenly no longer in his sights, would be forced to pull up, to bleed off his own speed, and to reposition for another attack. And during that small, crucial window of time, as the Zero was passing by, your own gunners would have a clear, unobstructed shot at its vulnerable side and belly. It was textbook physics. It was also, from a pilot's perspective, completely and utterly insane. Slowing down in the middle of a combat engagement violated every single, deeply ingrained instinct of a pilot. Aviators are trained from their very first day in flight school to equate speed with survival, to deliberately throttle down to make yourself a slower, fatter target, while you are under attack, felt like an act of surrender. Worse, the maneuver required a level of perfect, almost supernatural timing. If you did it too early, the Zero pilot would see what you were doing and would have time to adjust his own speed. If you did it too late, you would take the full, devastating force of his cannon fire. The margin for error was non-existent. Zeamer, in his own quiet and methodical way, pitched the idea to his squadron commander. The response was blunt, immediate, and dismissive. Slowing down, the commander told him, would just make them an easier target. It would destabilize the aircraft, potentially causing a fatal stall. The idea was officially filed away under the heading of dangerous nonsense. Zeamer did not argue, he did not protest, he simply stopped talking about it, but he did not stop thinking about it. And in the small, marginal adjustments he made on his own, lonely reconnaissance flights, he had begun to test the edges of his theory. He had noticed the way that the Japanese pilots, who were trained in a very rigid and doctrinally pure form of combat, would often hesitate, their own decision-making cycle disrupted for a crucial second when a bomber behaved in an unpredictable way. He had noticed that their attacks were textbook, and textbook for a man like Zeamer meant predictable. His own small experiments, flying slightly slower on his approach, altering his attack runs by just 30 seconds, changing his altitude in small, unexpected increments, all of these had been designed to break the enemy's rhythm. And his crew had started coming home, their planes battered, but their bodies intact. The statistics from his own private logbook were subtle, but they were real. His missions had a lower casualty rate, they were taking fewer hits, they were making cleaner exits from the target area. The other pilots in the squadron dismissed it as Zeamer's luck. Zeamer himself, if asked, would have dismissed it as simple probability. He did not boast, he did not try to prove his theory to anyone else. He just kept refining it in the quiet laboratory of his own mind, waiting for the moment when the stakes would be high enough, when the odds would be long enough, that the insane idea would become the only logical option left. That moment was coming. On June 16, 1943, Jay Zeamer Jr. and his crew are handed a mission that everyone on the airbase knows is a death sentence. The assignment is to fly north to the island of Bougainville, deep in the heart of Japanese-held territory, to photograph the enemy airfields and the shipping lanes. The brief is short and grim. Expect heavy fighter resistance, no friendly escort, no backup. The operation is considered so dangerous that it is officially classified as voluntary. Zeamer accepts it without a moment's hesitation. His crew, the misfits and the cast-offs, agree to go with him, not because they are particularly brave, but because they trust his calculations. Dawn comes slow and heavy over the Doyadura airfield. The jungle at the edge of the runway hums with the sound of insects. The ground crews move in a tired, pre-dawn silence, checking fuel lines and patching the previous day's bullet holes with flimsy sheets of aluminum tape. Zeamer's B-25 sits at the end of the runway, looking older and heavier than the rest of the squadron's planes. It is an aircraft that has been officially written off for combat duty twice. It should not still be flying. Zeamer walks the perimeter of the plane, his tall, thin frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He checks the gun mounts personally. He reviews the fuel calculations with his navigator one last time. He briefs his crew in his usual quiet monotone. 17 minutes over the target. If we take fire, we head east toward the open water. If we lose an engine, we will have enough glide potential to reach this coordinate on the map. No one asks him what will happen if they lose 2 engines. They take off at 400 hours, the sky still a deep, inky black. Zeamer flies low just above the waves to stay below the reach of the Japanese radar. The ocean below is black and featureless. The radio is silent. There is no fighter escort, just the steady, droning hum of their 2 engines and the faint, familiar smell of hydraulic fluid. By 600, they reach the target area. The sun is now rising over the island of Buka, just north of Bougainville. Zeamer climbs to the designated photo altitude. The bombardier, positioned in the nose of the aircraft, begins snapping his images. The Japanese military installations spread out below them like a perfect, detailed blueprint. Airstrips, fuel depots, transport ships moored in the harbour. Then the first Zero appears. It rises from below, fast and angled, the morning sun glinting off its wings. Then another, then 4 more, 6 in total, a full, deadly hunter-killer group. "Rear gunner reports contacts," a voice crackles over the intercom. Zeamer acknowledges his own voice calm. He maintains his course. The photo run is not finished. 45 seconds remaining. The Zeros circle them, probing, like wolves circling a wounded buffalo. They do not attack immediately. They are coordinated, they are disciplined, they are waiting for the bomber to break its formation. To panic, to run, that is when they will strike. Zeamer finishes the photo run. He banks the heavy bomber to the east, full throttle, standard procedure. The escape run has begun. The Zeros close in. The first burst of cannon fire from one of the fighters rips through the tail section of the B-25. Alarms scream in the cockpit. The hydraulic pressure drops. The rear gunner returns fire, but the Zero is already gone, looping back for another pass. Zeamer watches the Japanese formation. He counts their spacing. He measures their approach angles. He notes their speed. They are setting up a rolling, coordinated attack, one after another. It is textbook. And textbook, for Zeamer, means it is predictable. The second Zero dives from above. Zeamer holds his course and he waits. The fighter closes to 400 yards, 300, 250. Then Zeamer does what no one, not his own crew, and certainly not the Japanese pilot, expects him to do. He cuts the throttles. The heavy bomber lurches, its forward momentum suddenly, violently arrested. The Zero, which was just moments from a perfect kill, screams past, overshooting the bomber by a dozen yards. The B-25's top turret gunner tracks it as it passes, firing a long, sustained burst. The tracer rounds walk across the Zero's fuselage. A plume of black smoke pours from its engine. It spirals down towards the jungle, trailing a long ribbon of fire. The other Japanese pilots hesitate. Their own attack runs momentarily disrupted, confused. Bombers do not slow down. They run. This one has just stopped running. Zeamer does it again. Another Zero commits to a stern attack. Zeamer throttles down and in a stroke of pure, instinctive genius, drops 10 degrees of his landing flaps. The bomber's speed drops even more dramatically. The fighter overshoots. The waist gunner opens fire and the Zero breaks off, trailing a thin line of smoke. Now the enemy is uncertain. Their coordinated textbook attacks become erratic and individual. They try different angles. Zeamer, in his cockpit, varies his response. Sometimes he slows. Sometimes he drops his altitude abruptly. Sometimes he throttles up at the last second, throwing off their timing completely. It is not dogfighting, it is the art of disruption. The Zeros are burning fuel. They are having to constantly reposition. They are overshooting their target, and they are taking fire from angles they did not anticipate. One by one, they begin to disengage. By the time Zeamer's battered bomber crosses back into Allied airspace, 4 of the Zeros have been driven off. 2 of them are confirmed as damaged and are unlikely to make it back to their base. The B-25 itself is shot full of holes. The hydraulics are failing. One of the engines is stuttering and coughing black smoke, but the crew, miraculously, is alive. Zeamer lands the plane on one engine, and with no brakes, it skids off the runway and comes to a stop in the soft mud at the edge of the jungle. For a long moment, there is only silence. Then the hatch opens. The crew climbs out, their bodies shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and relief. The ground crews who rush to the scene stare at the aircraft in disbelief. It looks like it has flown through a sawmill. There are over 500 bullet and shrapnel holes in its fuselage and wings. The tail section is shredded. The cockpit canopy is cracked. Blood streaks the floor of the cabin. Zeamer is wounded. So is the bombardier. So is the navigator. But they had refused to abort the mission. They had completed their photo run. They had brought the pictures home. And they had survived something that should, by all rights, have